Today's daf is daf Yud Zayin. We're going to start here on Tes Zayin Amud Beis. V'she'en nishboim lavar al mitzvahs, 3 lines up from the bottom. And the Gemara is going to analyze the following question: from whence do we derive the conclusion that ein nishboim levatel es mitzvah? For example, if a person takes a shvur that he won't eat matzah on Leil Pesach, he won't sit in the sukkah. Until now, the Gemara had derived this conclusion from Bal Yachel Dvaro. So the Gemara asks, Mehocha nafkala? We derive from B'Yachel Dvaro that Dvaro ain't a machal, avol mischal l'shem shamayim. Mehosam nafkala. We have a different derivation, and we're going to have to justify both yalfusas. Why do we need 2 yalfusas? The Sanya Yochel Nishpa Levatel Asam Mitzvah Lo Bitel Yochel Yechayev. A person says, I won't eat matzah on Leil Pesach, took a shvur, and then he went ahead and he ate the matzah. So should he be chayev for shvuas bitui? And a person who violates shvuas bitui is chayev a korban ola v'yored. And now we turn to daf Yud Zayin, Talmud Lomar, but we've derived from the pasuk with regard to korban shvuas bitui in Vayikra Hey. The Torah says, I'll read the whole pasuk. Nefesh kisi shava levateis b'svasayim lahara. Lahara means that he takes a shvur that he won't eat something, or lehetiv, where he takes a shvur that he will eat something. And now, these 2 shvuras, lahara lehetiv, are written right next to each other. That creates a hekesh. And what is this hekesh going to teach me? Ma hatova, just like in the case of a person who takes a shvur to eat something that's mutter, rishus, he's not being mevatel any mitzvah. Like, let's say, for example, he would take a shvur that he would eat nevelos and treifas. That would not be included under this parasha here, because this parasha of hatava is referring to rishus. He's allowing him, or taking a shvur to the effect that he'll eat something that's mutter. So too, through this hekesh, af hara, even when he takes a shvur shelo yochal, rishus, he says, I won't eat something that I'm allowed to eat. And this is coming to exclude yotza nishpa levatel as mitzvah. If a person takes a shvur that he won't eat matzah on Leil Pesach, he won't sit in the sukkah on Chagas Sukkos v'lo bitel, and he went ahead and he was makayim the mitzvah of matzah or yeshir of the sukkah, and he violated shvur, he's potter. In other words, in the parasha of Karban, shvuas bitur, the Torah has a patur here that's derived from the hekesh between lehetiv and lahara, she'ein rishus biyado, because he doesn't have, through shvur, the authority and the ability to be mevatel a mitzvah. He can't say, I won't sit in sukkah. He's meshubad by the Torah law to sit in the sukkah. He's obligated to be makayim the mitzvah, and therefore his shvur is not going to generate a chiyuv karban in event that he violates the shvur by sitting in the sukkah, by eating the matzah. So now the Gemara says we have to go back and ask the question: why do we need the pasuk lo yachal dvaro, as we learned on daf Tes Zayin, to teach me that hanishpa levatel sab mitzvah ein shvuaso chala? We derive that conclusion from lahar lehetiv. And the Gemara now answers that we need both psukim. Chadkra, we need one pasuk lahara lehetiv in the parasha of Karban Shvur. And what do we need that for? Lemiftere, to pater him up from a Karban Shvur, an event that he violates his Shvur, and he sits in the sukkah and he eats the matzah. And in such a case, since he was nishpa levatel as a mitzvah, then when he violates the mitzvah, the shvur, for the sake of kiyum mitzvah, he's parted from a korban. So one drasha, meaning the hekesh of lahar lehetiv, is going to generate a ptur. We're going to derive a ptur in korban, the chad, and then we need the limud, the drasha from lo yachal dvaro lemiftere min lav the shvur, to teach me that he doesn't even violate the lav of shvur. Not only is he parted from the korban, but he doesn't violate the lav of lo yachol dvaro, and he doesn't get malchus. So here the Achronim all ask the famous kasha, why do you need two psukim? If from lo yachol dvaro you derive the conclusion that a nishba levatel is a mitzvah does not violate the mitzvah, his shvuah is not generated, and there's no bal yachol dvaro when he goes and he fulfills the mitzvah against the shvuah. Why do I need another pasuk, another hekesh of lahar lahetiv to derive a ptur karman? If you've already told me that he didn't violate the lav, then is there a havamina that he could be chayiv a karban if he didn't violate the lav? And we offer three different scenarios in which there's a possibility that even though he doesn't violate the lav of bal yachol, nevertheless he would still be chayiv shvuah if not for the alfusa of lahar lahetiv. Number one, the first of the three scenarios is a person who does what's called a shvuah bekolel. Has nothing to do with any sort of kol that you're familiar with, but anyway, hanishba levatel is mitzvah bekolel, which means that he takes a shvuah that includes both a dover heter and a bittul mitzvah. And the Ramban is of the opinion in Masechet Shvuas in Milchames on Daf Yud Beis and Beis that in such a case the shvuah is chal, and he would be chayav for bal yachol dvaro. And the question is whether or not he has to bring a karban for violating the shvuah, being mekayim the mitzvah, and that's why we need this pasuk lahar lahativ to pater him from a karban, even though he violates the law. The second scenario is at the time that he took the shvuah, he wasn't aware of the fact that he was being mevatel a mitzvah. Many Rishonim hold that in such a case, the shvuah would be chal. It's not considered a shvuah levatel some mitzvah because he didn't deliberately, not knowingly, take the shvuah to be mevatel a mitzvah. But yet this pasuk is going to teach me that despite the fact that he is in violation of al yacha because the shvuah is chal, but nevertheless he's parted from a karban. And the third scenario is in a case where in his shvuah he didn't prohibit himself from being mekayim the mitzvah, but rather he took a shvuah b'lashon neder. What does it mean a shvuah b'lashon neder? He took a shvuah that this sukkah should be asur alai, this matzah should be asur alai. And many Rishonim would hold in such a case the shvuah is chal, but we have a pasuk that nevertheless he is patur from a karban. And this leads us to the Mishnah on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. Now, in the previous Mishnah, we've already established a Chumrah Nedarim above and beyond Shvuah that Neder is chal on a Dvar Mitzvah, Shvuah is not chal on a Dvar Mitzvah. And in this Mishnah that we're learning now is going to be a hemshech of that earlier Mishnah. Yesh Neder b'toch Neder. You can take a Neder on top of a Neder, and basically the second neder is a repeat of the first neder, and the second neder is going to be chal. We'll see exactly in the Mishnah how that happens. But ein shvuah chal b'toch shvuah. The second shvuah, which is a repeat of the first, will not be chal. Ketzad. What's the case of neder shechal al neder? That's very interesting that the Mishnah is referring to Nazirus, but nevertheless uses the word neder. And apparently, since Kabbalah's Nazirus is included on the neder, the Torah says, Ish o Isha ki yafli lindar neder nazir lahazil Hashem. Therefore, the word neder is appropriate for Nazirus. Omar hareini nazir im ochel, hareini nazir im ochel. Now, for our purposes, we're going to take out the two words im ochel that repeat itself twice, because the Rishonim say that it's totally irrelevant here in this context. Let's just read it like this, and then we'll see why the Mishnah added the words im ochel. Amar hareini nazir, and then he says again, hareini nazir. So what does this mean? It sounds like the second hareini nazir, the second Kabbalah's nazir, is totally superfluous and meaningless. So again, the reason why it says im ochel in both cases is only agav the seifa. The Ran says the seifa is going to be a case of shvur shelo ochel. So therefore, in the neder, the Mishnah used the language im ochel. But again, as we said before, hareni nazir, and then the Mishnah says v'yachal if he violates the nazirus. Then, well, actually, v'yachal means he was mekayim the Tanai, and again, the Tanai here is secondary. But chayva kol achas v'yachas. On each amira, each declaration of hareni nazir, he's going to have to and be required to count a full 30 days of nazirus. Each Kabbalah is chal in sequence. The first Kabbalah will be chal first on the immediate 30 days. He will complete that first nazirus, bring a korban, shave his hair off, and then goes back to counting another series of an additional 30 days for the second Kabbalah's nazirus. So it means that he's chayav in the second nazirus, even though he's completing his first nazirus, and that's called neder b'toch neder. However, a shvua is not chal b'toch shvua. What's the case? He declares shvua shelo ochal, and then again he repeats himself shvua shelo ochal, and then v'yochal he violates his shvua. Eino chayav ela achas. He brings one korban in the case where he ate it the shogig, as malchus we ate it the meziv, but only one round. The second shvua is not chal. Now the Ran explains in the Dibra Maskil Shvua that the reason why the second shvua is not chal on the first shvua is because of a general principle in halacha called ein isur chal isur. And therefore, not only is he parted from a korban for the second shvua, but also he does not get any malchus for the second shvua because ein shvua chal shvua, ein iser chal iser. Now, we had a case of shvua l'kayim es mitzvah. And even though he's mushba v'omer me'ar Sinai to be mekayim the mitzvah, he will get malchus if he violates the mitzvah by virtue of the second shvua. So again, when he takes a shvua and then another shvua, the second shvua does not generate an isur because ein isur chal isur. But in a case where he takes a shvua to be mevatel, he takes a shvua to be mekayim a mitzvah. Let's say he takes a shvua that'll eat matzah. Then, as far as malchus is concerned, he does become liable for the second shvua in event that he doesn't eat matzah. Again, we have to get into the whole issue of whether any Yisrael Chal Yisrael means the second Yisrael is not Chal at all, or it's Chal without a Chi of Malchus. We also have to get into another issue here, and that is whether or not this is a Chi of Malchus b'Shevi Altasa, because he took a shvur to be Makayim the mitzvah. He was not Makayim the mitzvah, so he was passive, and would he get Malchus for that? Let's now look at the Gemara. And we're going to learn the Gemara first according to the Girsa of the Ran. Now, our Mishnah established that Hareni Nazim Ochel, he's Chaya for each one. So the Gemara asks the following question. Why do you need to tell me that he said all this, Hareni Nazir Ochel, came in the Yom Hareni Nazir, Havili Nazir. Once he says the words Hareni Nazir, then he already accepted upon himself Nazirus. And if he says again Hareni Nazir, then he should be chayav to be counting two Nazirus. And not only that, furthermore, the Gemara is implying another question. If he accepted upon himself a Nazirus on a condition in Ochal, So why does he have to say twice, Harini Nazir, in order to be chayiv on both Naziris? Even if he would say it only one time, Harini Nazir, the Chiyachal Tuva, if he ate more than one kizayis worth of yayin, let's say, if he was Makayim Tanai and he ate more than one kizayis, umasrim be'er, on each kizayis that he eats, we told him that, gave Masra that it'll be mischayev for each achila another nazirus, is mechayev al kol achila v'achila. Then he's mechayev for each and every kizayis. Like the Gemara says in the Masechet Shavuos on Daf Chav Zayin with Beis, if a person takes a shvur shelo ochal kikar zeh, then he's chayev for every single kizayis that he eats. Every kizayis would generate a chiyuv malchus. So we see that with each kizayis of achila, there's a chiyuv unto itself by virtue of the neder of the shvur. So here too, if he was toles as naziruso, he made it tonight, and he said of ochal, then we should also in this case interpret it that on each kizayis and kizayis that he ate, he's going to be mischayev with an additional nazir. So why did the Tana Mishnah have to say that he repeated himself already nazir? Just the fact that he said im ochal would be enough to replace the second Kabbalah, as if he had said already nazir a second time, because each kizayis would generate its own hischayvus of nazir. So the Gemara answers, the Tani, as we saw earlier, shvur shel ochal, the Sefer of the Mishnah, he says shvur shel ochal, and there we have to say that he took a shvur shel ochal. I mean, that's what the shvur is. Otherwise, there's no content to the shvur. And not only that, he has to say shvur shel ochal twice, because otherwise there's no chiddush of ein shvur chal shvur. Where's the second shvur? His Tananami also in the Reisha, with regard to Areni Nazim Ochal, it uses the same language in order to maintain the symmetry. As we said before, it's enough that he repeats himself Hareni Nazir, and he has to count two Nazirios. And if Enochinami, he would say Hareni Nazim Ochal, then even without repeating Hareni Nazir, he would have to count the separate Naziris for each kizayis that he eats. That's the girsa of the Ran. Now let's go back to the girsa that we have in our Gemaras. Amar Avuna lo shonim. When do we say this could be a machlokas between Rav Huna and Shmuel? When do we say that in Nidrei Naziris there's a neder b'toch neder? That's elo. It's only the Amar Hareni Nazir Ayom, Hareni Nazir L'macha. He separates the first Kabbalah's Naziris from the second on 2 different days. The migu deka mitosaf Yoma Yisera, from the fact that he adds a second Naziris on top of the first Naziris, then we say that the second Naziris is Chal al HaNaziris Harishona, and therefore he has to count a second Naziris. So again, by saying that in his second Kabbalah Hareni Naziris L'machar, he had room for his second Naziris to be Chal. And once he adds a second Nazirus, then Halacha takes over, that a Nazirus generates a chiyuv of 30 days. Avol says Rav Huna, Omar, if he declared Hareni Nazir Hayom, and again he repeats himself Hareni Nazir Hayom, Eina Chala HaNazirus, the second Nazirus is not Chala al Nazirus, on top of the first Nazirus. That's the Shita of Rav Huna. So again, what's the case of the Mishnah according to Rav Huna? Hareni Nazir Hayom, Hareni Nazir L'mocha. And then, after he finishes the counting of the first Nazirus for 30 days, then, even though he didn't say at that point a second Kabbalah, it doesn't matter. Since he had originally added another day of Nazirus to the first Kabbalah through his second Nazirus, he has to count another 30 days. So it means that even though he really was makabel on himself a Nazirus of 1 day by adding L'machar, but nevertheless, he still has to count a full 30 days against his will. And all this is the sheet of the Ran based on a Sugya Nazir, Daf Zion. Shmuel disagrees with Rav Huna. Shmuel Omar Afilu Omar Hareini Nazir Hayom. Hareini Nazir Hayom. In other words, he did not add an extra day to his second Kabbalah's Naziris. Nevertheless, Chala Naziris Aleh. The second Naziris is Chal by virtue of his second Kabbalah, and he's got to count two different Nazirios. And this is based on a drasha that we'll soon see from the pasuk Nazir Lahazir, the double language which is redundant of Nazir Lahazir, to teach me that Nazirus Chala al Nazirus. Even if he says twice, Hareini Nazir Hayom. So again, we're applying the principle according to Rav Huna of adding an extra day of Nazirus, and that creates a Kabbalah. According to Shmuel, we're applying a different principle, and that is every separate Kabbalah generates its own minyan and melos Nazirus of 30 days. Now, according to Rav Huna, when he counts the first set of 30 days, that's not included in the second Kabbalah's Nazirus. In other words, the question we're raising here is, which is going to be a machlokas Rishonim, because here in the Masechet quotes other Rishon Rabbeinu Avram ben Ahar, is that according to the Ran, if he drinks wine, let's say during any of these two periods of time, the first 30 or the second 30, he doesn't get two sets of malchus. He has a chiyuv to be noed two nazirios, and when he completes the 30 days for the first nazirios, he has to go back and count another 30 days for the second. But there's no point in time where he will be chayav two sets of malchus for the two Kabbalahs. They don't overlap at all. One ends and the other begins. However, although that's the sheet of the Ran, there are other Rishonim who disagree. We mentioned Rabbeinu Avram ben Ahar. Also, it seems that the Ramban holds like this, that Nazirus Chalal Nazirus means that if he was Makabal on himself Nazirus, then he went back and he was Makabal on himself a second Nazirus. Both Isuri Nazirios are Chal now, immediately. They overlap. And if he eats anovim or he drinks wine, he'll get two sets of malchus, a double set, 78 malchus. And that which he counts 30 days, an additional 30 days for the second Nazirus, as Rav Huna says, that's not because the Nazirus of one day is machayev him to be knowing another Nazirus of Shloshim Yom, but rather, and here's the language of the Ramban, Mikevan shahosif b'Nazirus hashniya Yom Echad. In the second Kabbalah, he added a day, Shloya Oserbo, which was not prohibited by virtue of the first Nazirus. Therefore, the Isur is Chal al Isur. And the second Nazirus Shniya that he accepts upon himself is also Chal. So he has a double Chiv Nazirus, and he gets two sets of Malchus. And this has to do with another concept called Isur Chalal Isur Be'Isur Mosif. If he adds an additional day to his first Nazirus, the second Isur is Mosif on the first Isur, and that's called an Isur Kolel, and that's going to be Kolel an additional day of Nazirus. So it means that by virtue of the first Nazirus, there was a day that was not Asur, and that day becomes Asur now by virtue of the second Kabbalah's Nazir. Frekting an eyes in the cash against Rav Huna. Ul Rav Huna aditana ein shvua b'toch shvua. Listening ein neder b'toch neder. If we want to maintain a parallel between the Hareini Nazir Hayom, which, according to Rav Huna, ain't Nazirus Chala Nazirus. It's only when the second Kabbalah's Nazirus was L'machar. Is then the Tana of Av Mishnah distinguishes between Neder and Shvuah, that there is Neder b'toch Neder, but in Shvuah there's Ein Shvuah b'toch Shvuah. That doesn't make any sense. Because the mashmos is that the Neder itself, in any event, Yesh Neder b'toch Neder. Whereas according to Rav Huna, even in the case of Neder, there's a principle called Ein Neder b'toch Neder. If he says Hareini Nozer Hayom, so that's also Ein Neder b'toch Neder. If that be the case, then Neder and Shvuah should be absolutely identical. Listening, it should have said that in some cases Yesh Neder b'toch Neder, and in other cases Ein Neder b'toch Neder. And then the Mishnah could have explained, the Tana should have said Ketzad, Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer L'machar, Yesh Neder b'toch Neder, Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer Hayom is Ein Neder b'toch Neder. And then the exact same parallel halacha would apply in Shvuah. If he takes a Shvuah Shalochal and then again a Shvuah Shalochal is Ein Shvuah. That's like the case of Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer Hayom. But if he takes a Shvuah of Shalochal Hayom, and then he takes another Shvuah Shalochal L'machar, then the second Shvuah will be Chal on top of the first Shvuah. There's no fundamental difference, according to Rav Huna, between Neder and Shvuah. And therefore the language of the Mishnah, which reads that Yesh Neder Toch Neder Yein Shvuah Toch Shvuah, the contrast between the two, is not accurate at all. According to Rav Huna's understanding of the Mishnah, they're exactly identical. In each case, we want to know if the second Neder or the second Shvuah extends beyond the first. Now the Gemara comes on to ask a second kasha against Rav Huna Tanan. Now, the Mishnah says Yesh Neder B'toch Neder Yein Shvuah B'toch Shvuah. And the Gemara clarifies, Heichi Dami, where is this halacha of Neder B'toch Neder? He Leva Deka Omar, as Rav Huna would interpret it. The Omar of Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer L'machar. And since he adds to his second Nazirus another day, and that means that, again, according to the Ran, the 31st day, he adds, is therefore the Nazirus is Chal. And once the Nazirus is Chal, as we said earlier, he has to count another additional 30 days of Nazirus, all told 60 days of Nazirus. And this has to do with a principle that there's no such thing as Nazirus of Yom Echad. If a person says, Hareini Nozer Yom Echad, he has to count 30 days of Nazirus. Then, Utekavasa Gabi Shvuah, if you have a parallel case of Ein Shvuah Chala B'toch Shvuah, then you're going to have to interpret it in a similar case, otherwise you have no contrast. You're going to have to say that somehow the second Shvuah adds something to the first Shvuah. For example, the first Shvuah was Shelo Ochal Ta'enim, because of Yom HaShvuah Shelo Ochal Ad Novin. So he went from figs and now he adds dates. So he adds something in his second Shvuah to expand the nature of his Isra Achila of a Shvuah through to include even Ad Novin. And in such a case, Ein Shvuah Sashniach Chala. Correct the Gemara, my lo Chala Shvuah Shvuah. That doesn't make any sense at all. The second Shvuah enjoins him from eating Anova. The first Shvuah only enjoined him from eating Te'enim. So that would not make any sense. That could not be the interpretation of the Mishnah that Nozer Hayom and Nozer L'machar, because then it would be parallel to a case of Te'enim and Anova, which certainly the second Shvuah would be Chal. So what does it mean, Lo Chal Shvuah Shvuah? Elahechi Dami, we have no choice but to insist that what's the case? The Lo Chal Shvuah Shvuah, where the second Shvuah is not Chal on top of the Rishonah. Kigon, the Amar Shvuah Shlo Chal Te'enim, V'chazer v'amar shvur shelo ochal te'enim. If that be the case, then we have to go back according to Rav Huna to the case of Nazirus, and the parallel case of Nazirus would be the Gavosigam in Nazirus, where he says, "Already knows Rayom, already knows Hayom." In other words, if the second shvur is not chal because it's identical to the first shvur, he's already, shall we say, mushpa v'yomim har Sinai, not to eat te'enim by virtue of his first shvur. So the second shvur can't be chal on the first shvur, like the principle of mushpa v'yomim. So then, with the Kavase, its parallel scenario in Nazirus would be, if you come to Hareini Nozer Hayom, twice he accepts upon himself Nazirus on the same day. Uktani Yesh Neder B'toch Neder, and that's the case where the Mishnah establishes the contrast between Neder and Shvur, and therefore Yesh Neder B'toch Neder, and the second Nazirus B'chal is Kashler Rav Huna, who says that Hareini Nozer Hayom, the second Nazirus is not chal. Rav Huna, the Gemara says, you know what Rav Huna would answer to defend himself? That when it says in the Mishnah, Masechet Yesh Neder L'Tok Neder, what's the case? The Yoma Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer L'Moch, or he adds another day of Nazirus, the second Nazirus extends beyond the first, and that's why the second Nazirus is chal. But the Kavasa, Gabi Shvur, the parallel case in Shvur, would be the Yomar Shlochal Te'enim, the Chazar, the Yomar Shvur Shlochal Te'enim Ve'anov. So he is Mosif, he adds something to his second Shvur above and beyond the first Shvur, because the first Shvur was limited to what? To Te'enim. The second Shvur expanded and included not only Te'enim, but also Anavim, and that's the exact parallel to Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer L'Moch, where the second Neder, or in that case Nazirus, extends beyond the first. Here too in Shvur, the second Shvur extends beyond the first. So even though he added in the second Shvur something that wasn't, that he didn't accept upon himself in the first Shvur, nevertheless, Lo Chayla, the second Shvur, is not chal. Why? Because there's no possibility of violating the second Shvur without violating the first Shvur. In other words, it's only through Achilas Te'enim that he can violate the second Shvur if he eats together with Te'enim Anovim. Because the second Shvur was Shelo Ochal Te'enim Va'anovim, doesn't mean either Te'enim or Anovim, but both together, Te'enim Va'anovim B'yachad. Now, if the second Shvur is going to be violated by eating both Te'enim and Anovim B'yachad, well, as soon as he eats the Te'enim, he has already violated his first Shvur. He's Mushpa V'yomim V'ashvur. So therefore, the second Shvur cannot be chal. You can't say that the second Shvur is Mosif on the first Shvur if the only way he can violate the second Shvur is by violating his first Shvur and eating Te'enim, but he's already Mushpa V'yomim on the Te'enim. Now, this is in contrast to Nazirus, right? Even though the second Nazirus is not chal on the 29 days after the first day of his Nazirus, but nevertheless, the Nazirus is going to be chal to generate an additional 30 days. So the second Nazirus goes beyond the first Nazirus. And there's no need to violate the first Nazirus in order to violate the second, because they're two different periods of time. And now we have the contrast between Shvur and Neder, or Shvur and Nazirus. So now the Gemara says, no, you're wrong. I have a question to try to prove that the second Shvur, which adds Anovim together with Te'enim, would be chal. Amar Rabba, Shvur shelo chal Te'enim. Because Amar Shvur shelo chal Te'enim Anovim. V'yochal Te'enim. He went ahead and mistakenly, unintentionally, he ate Te'enim b'shogeg. V'hifrish karban. So now he was mafrish a karban shvuas bitui for violating the first shvua Shogeg, and now Rabbi says if now b'shogeg he eats another kezayis, in addition to the first kezayis of Teinim, he now eats a kezayis of anovim, then he violates a second shvua in addition to the first, because now he's eaten both Teinim and anovim. And nevertheless, we're going to say that since before he ate the anovim, he was mafresh a korban on achilas teinim, havelei anovim chatzi shir. The ein meviim korban al chatzi shir. So in other words, as far as the first achila of teinim is concerned, he's already covered that. He already has a korban designated for that achila. So the second korban would be engendered by eating anovim, as an addition to the Teinim that he already ate, but that's already a Chatzi Shir, because the second Shvur was on both Anovim and Teinim. And now, after being Mafresh the korban on the first, he now eats Anovim and only Anovim. That's a Chatzi Shir. So he's not having an additional korban by virtue of his Achilas Anovim. And the Gemara now is Nedarim. It's only because he was Mafresh the korban on Teinim. That's why he's not chayav a korban on Achilas Anovim. But if he had not been mafresh the korban on Teinim in the first achila, he would be chayav two korbanos, one for the first shvur and one for the second. Alma, we see, heicha dekad bi'omar shvur shlo ochal Teinim v'chazav yom shvur shlo ochal Teinim v'anovim is migo dechal shvur anovim chayla nami Teinim. Since the second shvur adds an iser of achilas anovim to the first, therefore the second shvur is chal even on Te'enim. And even though on Te'enim he's already mushpa Yomi Mar Sinai, but since the second shvur is chal vis-a-vis anovim, it now grabs with it, so to speak, a chiyuv shvur on Te'enim as well. So we see that we have to reject what we said before in the Gemara, that the Mishnah, according to Rav Huna, is addressing a case of nishpa shlo chal Te'enim because of nishpa shlo chal Te'enim anovim, and to say that ain't shvur chal shvur, because in this case the halacha would be shvur chal al shvur. And the more answers, Rav Huna lo sfir like her Rabba. Rav Huna never accepted Rabba, and he understood the Mishnah as yesh neder b'toch neder when he says already knows v'ayom already knows l'mochar. Ain't shvur b'toch shvur when he says shvur shlo chal te'enim, and then he says shvur shlo chal te'enim anovim. And Rav Huna rejected Rabba. And he never accepted the principle that by virtue of the fact that the second shvua adds anovim to the first, therefore the second shvua is chal. No. According to Rav Huna, the second shvua is not chal, even vis-a-vis anovim. Why? Because the second shvua can't be chal without the shvuas te'enim, and he already is mushba b'yomed on te'enim by virtue of the first shvua. Meisvei, the Gemara asks the following kasha against Rav Huna from someplace else. Misha nazar shtei nazirus umanes harishon v'ifrish korban. He finishes his nazirus and he was mafresh his korban for hashlomas malos nazirus. V'nishal aleh, and now he goes to a chacham, and the chacham is matir his original nazirus. And there's halacha in Hatoras Chacham called Chacham Oker Es HaNeder Mikaro. In other words, the Chacham works his Hatoras Chacham is Chal Mafreya, as if he never accepted upon himself the first Nazirus. So there was a Hatoras Neder on the first Nazirus, and now he had accepted upon himself two Nazirus. Is also Lo Shniya V'Rishona. Since he completed his Nazirus Rishona, that Nazirus Rishona could be chal as a fulfillment of his second Nazirus. Even though, again, at the time that he was observing his Nazirus, he was doing it for the first Nazirus, the first Kabbalah, which was Nekar L'Mafreya by virtue of Torah's Chacham. So Gemara asks if he done it. In what case can he be Yotzei his Chovas Nazir Shnia by virtue of the days that he observed Nazirus Rishona, which was Nekar L'Mafreya. Ilem Adiyom Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer L'Machar. Amai also Shniya B'Rishona. Why should the days that he fulfilled for the first Nazirus be Chal visit for the second Nazirus? Ha'ika Yomi Yisera. He had that extra day of Nazirus that he was obligated in by virtue of his second Kabbalah's Nazirus. So it means the Nazirus Shniya will only be Chal later on. L'macha. And it's only, he's going to be day 31 that's going to kick off his second Nazirus. So how could the first 30 days possibly be a fulfillment of his first Nazirus, of his second Nazirus, when his second Nazirus will only be Chal 31 days down the line? El Pshita, we have no choice but to assume that what's the case here in this Brisa? The Omar Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer Hayom. So it means the time for the fulfillment of the second Nazirus is identical to that of the first Nazirus. And both Nazirus are therefore Chal on the same day. And therefore the days that he counted and he observed for the first Nazirus can now be Ola for the minion of his second Nazirus. And on top of Ches Amud Aleph, Utyuv to the Rav Huna. And this undermines the Shita of Rav Huna. And the Gemara rejects it and says, "Lo, you're not forced to interpret the Brisa as referring to a case of Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer Hayom. Li'olam Hareini Nozer Hayom, Hareini Nozer L'macha." And in this case, even Rav Huna is moda that the second Nazirus is Chal. Umay also lo, and what did the Brisa mean when it says that he could fulfill his second Nazirus through the 30 days of his observance of the first Nazirus, which seems to imply that both Nazirus are at the same time, and yet the second Nazirus he said L'machar. L'bar me'ahu Yomi Yisera. What the Brisa meant is that he can be Yotzei 29 out of 30 days of his second Nazirus by virtue of his first 30 days. He still has to be Mashlim that day number 30 by virtue of his second Nazirus. Inami, another answer to defend Rav Huna against the Brisa, Yigon Shekibel Shtei Nazirus B'vas Achas. He said not Hareini Nozer, but rather he said Harei Alai Shtei Nazirus, or he said Hareini Nozer, Hareini Nozer. In these cases, Moder Rav Huna concedes that Shtei Nazirios Chalos, both Nazirus will be Chal. Okay then? So this is where even though we're still in the Sugi Rav Huna, this is where we'll stop for today. Wishing you a great Shabbos. Thank you so much.